Bill Nussey is the president and CEO of Silverpop Systems, one of the premier email marketing services in the country. Throughout his career, though, Bill has built management teams that have driven growth in early stage companies. As president and CEO of Silverpop, they support the online marketing needs of enterprise level organizations, a lot of Fortune 1000 companies. His company has been recognized as one of the fastest growing technology companies in Georgia consistently. Prior to joining Silverpop, though, Bill was also president and CEO of IXL Inc., a publicly traded e-business consulting firm that I'm sure we all know about. During his 3-year tenure with IXL, Bill executed an IPO, turned the company profitable, grew revenues from $10 million to $120 million per quarter, and grew its headcount from 400 to over 2,000 employees. So Bill knows what he's talking about when he talks about the challenges of managing growth. He also serves on in a number of community organizations that I won't go into, but in any event, it's with unusual pleasure that it's my great pleasure to introduce to you, and I hope you'll welcome Bill Nussey.
Thanks. Thanks. We'll get the slide here. All right, well, good morning. It's wonderful to come out here. This is always a good opportunity for me to reflect on some of the things that I've made mistakes about over the years and sort of write them down and see if there's some nugget of wisdom that I might actually not stumble the same way again in the future. And so but it's a very inward-looking opportunity for me to go and see what have I done that I liked and what have I done that I not. And so I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've observed having grown 3 or 4 different companies over the last 20 years, particularly around the notion of the management team, which is often overlooked as kind of a black box, particularly to investors. You know, you get the management team and everything's great. You get the wrong management team and everything's bad. But for those of us that actually build management teams, the nuances of how you do that is incredibly difficult and actually very counterintuitive. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about that. I remember I used to work as a venture capitalist for a firm called Greylock out of Boston. Not everyone's heard of Greylock, but in the VC world they're extremely famous. And I was walking down the hall the day I started with the founder of Greylock and one of the great, well-respected VCs of the last 30 years, a guy named Henry McCants. And Henry was walking me down the halls of Greylock, and you know, every 2 feet there was an S1, an IPO filing. And we walked down one hall of S1 of IPO filings and walked down another hall of S1 IPO filings and then a third wall, and all in all it was 180, and this was in the late 90s. They've been going strong since then. But and he stops at the end of the last one and he asks me, he says, how many of these companies that we've taken public or that have gone public that we invested in, what percentage of them, Bill, do you think went public on the business plan that we funded? Now, I knew it was a trick question, but because of all the pomp and circumstance around it, but I said a quarter, and of course I knew I was going to be wrong when I opened my mouth. He said none. He said not a single one of these companies went public on the business plan that we funded. And he said that's a good thing because we don't fund business plans, we fund management teams. And he said if you hear anything and you learn anything as a venture capitalist, you'll understand that the management team is the single most pivotal driver for the success of any particular business, because the circumstances and the context of businesses change all the time. And the management team is the one thing that'll see it through. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of areas. I'm going to take you through the 5 stages of a growth of a young company, particularly as it relates to the management team. But I want to be clear, just to set your expectations, what you're going to hear is that there is no such thing as a perfect management team. A lot of people suggest that there is. I will tell you that I think there's a perfect management team. I've never met one, but I can imagine a perfect management team for a particular stage of a company. But the perfect management team for a very young company is the worst possible management team for a more mature company in many cases, in fact, most cases. I also want to be clear that my perception or my point of view on the things I'll talk about are from someone who's largely run companies that sell to businesses and with a technology focus. So if you are in the professional services business selling to healthcare, you probably won't follow all of the metaphors I'm going to use exactly, but hopefully there's some value in it nonetheless. If you happen to be in a tech company selling to businesses, then some of these terms and approaches will resonate. And I thought I'd make it a little fun by putting together a quick quiz on each stage so you too can know whether or not your management team is ready for that particular stage. And then I'm going to wrap up with some observations I've made, particularly around one of the most interesting elements of growing a company, and that is the founders. And I'll preface for any of you that are founders or will become founders that I have been a founder. I've also wrestled mightily with founders of companies I've come in to run. So I think it's an appropriate one to wrap up with, because there's no more defining element of growing a young tech company than being in the founder or working with a founder. So without any further ado, some quotes. Failure doesn't always happen because people take their eye off the ball. Sometimes it happens just because people insist on sticking with what made them successful in the past. I love this. I didn't get the exact quote, but that's my paraphrase of it. And it's the very things that you do to make you successful when you're a young company will kill you when you're a mature company. To put it a little more differently in Nussey terms, it's better to be wrong than dead. And so many entrepreneurs blindly stick to the plan that got it. Listen, this approach, this management team, this idea, this thing got us this far. Obviously, it has to be right. Look how successful we are. And that's often the next thing they say before they're bankrupt or fired. So let me start with some of the basics. I'm going to use terms like leadership and management an awful lot today. And everyone has a definition, and I think it's pretty intuitive what they mean. But just in case you're not clear on it, I pulled some dictionary definitions. But what leadership does is it creates a vision, particularly as it relates to young tech companies. It acquires resources. It interprets outcomes. In other words, is this product a good outcome? Is this product a good product or a bad product? Is closing this customer a good thing or a bad thing? And interpreting that and providing that relative to a vision. And particularly, they communicate with stakeholders. And if a really good sign of leadership is that a leader will take the sum of all the parts and make it bigger than it could be just by adding them up. They have a chemistry, an alchemy that takes these individuals and these ideas and turns it into something much greater than the sum of the parts. And it's a very fine continuum, but in most respects, a dramatic difference when you start slipping into the management world. Many people use these together, and I'm probably going to mistakenly do that as well as synonyms. But I think they're fundamentally different as it relates to young companies. Management is the organization and coordination of resources. And again, we all know what it means, but it's projects and plans and things like that. And to put it in a little simpler terms, leadership is about people, whereas management's about process. And leadership is about vision, and management's about plans. And you generally get the idea. And I think as I go through the 5 stages, there's a definite shift from an emphasis on leadership towards an emphasis on management. And we'll get into some more depth on that. But leadership is always important. I think whether you're in the smallest business or you're in a Fortune 50 company, leadership is that undefinable element that makes a difference. When we see famous CEOs like Apple's Steve Jobs come back after being gone for years, and Apple going just pretty much horizontal, all of a sudden becomes one of the hottest companies on the planet Earth. Clearly Steve Jobs has had an impact. There's not just some luck happened there. And if you've read about Steve Jobs as I have, one thing you'll probably pick up is the guy's not a manager. He's a leader. So leader acts absolutely, and he's not necessarily a benign leader, but he is a leader. And leadership matters at all stages, but there's dramatically different kinds of leadership. And again, the term leader is so broad that I think it misses some of the important nuances. So for the sake of today's presentation, going to give you 2 metaphors for leadership. One is the bulldozer leadership, and the other is the bus driver leadership. If you can't figure out, Steve Jobs is the first one. On a bulldozer, you have only one passenger. There's only one seat in a bulldozer. There's no seats for passengers at all. They don't move very fast or very agilely, but they will absolutely go through anything. You either get behind that bulldozer as it plows through, or you're going to get plowed over. And by contrast, a bus driver, there's lots of seats for everybody in there, and they can get on or get off on their own accord. But getting people on board is the reason you have a bus. And when the bus moves, everyone moves the same way. And to start to get into the stages of the companies, pure startups and particularly turnaround situations like Apple, bulldozer leadership is essential because there's no consensus about the amount of pain and change. You'll never get a consensus about the pain and change required to take a business to the next step. Where when you're in an operating company, one that has to execute against a plan and achieve group targeted results, bus driving leadership is far more effective. It's also good for fast growth companies, particularly the leadership element of it, because you are moving at such a pace. Typical management systems, I've never seen a management system that can scale with the kind of growth that venture capitalists expect and look for young companies to achieve. So leadership is that element that keeps the management working from stage to stage to stage. But bus driver leadership, at least in my experience, and that's certainly my own style, I think, you have to ask people to work with me, but I think that's my style, tends to be more effective in fast growth young companies. So, there are 5 stages of growth for a young company. I'm going to go through each one of these and give you a little color for it. The first is the idea generation. This is the part where a couple of really smart people sit around, usually after their day jobs on the weekends, and scratching up business plans, endless Google searches, making telephone calls to people they know. This is where creativity is at its finest. Thinking through radical ideas, going out of the box, trying to break the status quo. People that do well in the management of this is really about avoiding conventional wisdom. I've never met anyone that started a company that everyone thought was an obvious idea, right? Usually a really genuine, great idea is seen as a bad idea when it's first started. So the people that sit around that table are people that are willing to ignore best practices, ignore the status quo. And the kind of leadership you want, the kind of management you want is no management at all. What you want is fearless leadership. Someone who can continue to say to the 2 or 3 other people around the table, I know this is another dead end and another dead end and another dead end, but let's just keep going because there's something here. There's absolutely something that we can make happen. You go to the prototype stage, which is one of my favorite parts of a young company, which is where you've got a pretty good idea, but then you've got to make something tangible that the rest of the world will buy into, right? You know it. In your heart, you've bought into it because you created this idea that you believe in, but the prototype stage is where you create something that the rest of the world will get. You can actually show it and demonstrate it. Now this could be a widget, it could be a new form of plastic bottle or a piece of software if you do what I do for a living. This is where the management needs to have a lot of technical depth, or at least depth in the areas that they're trying to create the prototype. I've seen a lot of companies create prototypes, and they don't call them prototypes, they call them first products. I would argue that they're prototypes. This is a really interesting part of a company because everything's inwardly focused until this stage. When you get to closing that first customer, all of a sudden the personality of the company changes dramatically because now you're actually calling on people. You're trying to get someone to close that first customer deal. This is where you're making those endless phone calls, getting those really painful rejections. This prototype you've worked so hard on just doesn't cut it for most of the people you talk to. Management starts to matter a little bit here. Leadership is still predominant because you're convincing the troops to go forward, to fight the great battles, to not give in the face of all the daunting no's. But management starts to matter because when you get that first customer, you've got to deliver. And that's where you've got to execute against a set of promises that were made, and management starts to matter. And this is a pretty painful period for a lot of companies. But it doesn't get any easier because it turns out that going from getting your first handful of customers to managing lots of customers is just as scary. And it's surprising how many companies die at this stage. We're going to talk about that. But this is where you actually have to have management in an active, ongoing way in the business because this is about the management team is developing processes and structures, and they're putting in place titles and reporting organizations and goals and plans. And this is where the experienced management actually starts to matter. Up until now, a group of very young or relatively inexperienced executives are going to make it pretty far. And they'll actually be able to eke their way through this stage if they work really hard, but they're probably not setting themselves up to be successful for the last stage, which is being grown up. And this is a stage where you've got hundreds of people working for you, and the whole company's management team is not focused on inventing something new, not focused on breaking the status quo, but focused on delivering on the promises that were made. And in a lot of ways, this is, to true founders and true innovators, this is pretty boring. And so a lot of people, you see a lot of heavy management changes occur typically in young companies between the fourth and fifth stage here. But in order to be successful in this grown-up stage, you need to have a management culture. You need to have a respect and a recognition for management. You need to have the science of management, the art of management, well understood by a lot of the executives in the company. And I've seen, as a venture capitalist and as an executive at young companies, a lot of people fight this stage, and they continue to try to have that ethic and that culture that was more leadership-centric, that was more firefighting, but heroic. And typically, companies at this stage either make this transition or they fail through mediocrity or worse. So let me take you through some additional depth in each of these 5 stages and give you my quizzes. I threw some numbers up on the right-hand side here just to give you a sense. However, you think about a business, maybe help you place these particular stages with some numbers, but I'm not going to talk a lot about them. when you talk about the idea stage, this is where invention is critical. And one of the things that people forget, especially if you haven't done this before, is that destruction. Actually disassembling or destroying something is a key part of invention. You know, how many times did Edison, how many failed light bulbs did Edison have before he finally got the formula right? I understand it's in the hundreds, if not thousands, of different attempts. So, and people tend to forget that part about invention. But a couple of things to keep in mind. Classic challenge I've seen here is that young entrepreneurs or first-time entrepreneurs, in their zeal to get the people on the bus with them, will find people that are buying into the company and are wanting to be part of it. And very often they're the very worst kind of people, not that they're not fine individuals, but the worst kind of managers or executives or individual contributors they actually need when they grow the company. So when you have an idea and you're trying to sell people on it, you don't feel like you're in a position to be picky about who you get on board. But remember, if you get the wrong people on board, you're stuck with it for a long time. Even worse is that in order to get somebody on board, maybe you're a technical person and you really need someone that can help you sell your ideas, and you know you're going to need that. So you've got to find someone you think that can sell. And you promise them not only the opportunity to sell in your future company, but to lead all sales. The first salesperson I ever hired was a school teacher, and because he was a sales personality, and I had no idea how sales worked. And that was very difficult. So the next salesperson, my first company was a software company, and so I learned my lesson, and very painful lesson indeed. And so my next salesperson was someone that had sold food for his entire career of 25 selling years, and he had worked for a company called Cisco, and he'd back the truck up to a restaurant and sell food. And I remember he was pitching a customer. We had hypertext help back when hypertext was a novel word, and you could click on something and it would go to another page. I remember him pitching a customer on the telephone saying, "We have hypersensitive help," and it was context-sensitive hypertext, but anyway, he did sell a lot, and we did let him run sales for a while, but eventually that blew out, and I have some of the funniest stories in my career about that particular guy. One of the things that I talk about a lot when I speak to entrepreneurs is that don't overstate the power of ideas. I will tell you that occasionally I hear an idea that as a one-time venture capitalist who saw thousands of ideas and said, "That's actually a really good idea, I haven't heard that before." But more often than not, 20 to 1, the idea isn't going to make your company successful. If you think you've got a really novel new idea, odds are very strong that there's 10 people who are funded by VCs out there doing it today. And so the winning, it doesn't mean they're going to win. It doesn't mean being late to market is a losing proposition. I remember when we decided at Silverpop, my current company, I joined it. It needed a bit of a turnaround and some adult leadership when I got in there. And we were actually in 3 different businesses and burning through gobs of cash every month. And we decided to, we went through the different things we were in, and all 3 were kind of stinky, so we had this little side project called email. We decided to raise it up as our primary business, actually after asking the investors whether they wanted their money back. And they said, "No, we like you guys, so see if you can make this email thing work." And we said, "Well, email, it's email." We've heard, there's this spam thing, and we're obviously not going to do that. It's a little scary, but we're just going to jump into it. Well, we were in a year and 2 years later, and we had no idea that this was a mature market with entrenched competitors, 500 million to $1 billion in revenue every year. We had no idea. And so obviously we've done very well, but what looked like a really good idea to us and something that was novel from our limited perspective turned out to be very old hat. So we had a much more uphill battle than we ever imagined. One of the other things, particularly new entrepreneurs struggle with, is getting that really fancy resume. They look at the people that want to be part of their organization, and I generally, in my early career, like that teacher and the food sales guy, if you could find someone with any kind of resume to augment the skills you needed, you would obviously jump at it. But I've learned over the years that the people that come knocking on your door at that stage, most typically with the big long resumes, are the very people you want to worry about. I have the same theory about international expansion. When you start moving internationally, a whole slew of people will knock on your door, and we're going through this in my company now. We've got operations, very successful operations in London. We're moving into Asia. People are knocking on our door offering to help us move into Asia. And when I was earlier in my career, I took those calls, and they had great resumes and all the things they'd done. But you know what? It's like Groucho Marx said, that any party or any club that would have me as a member is not a club I want to join. Anyone that's interested in helping my company at that stage that I'm not having to cajole and beg is probably not someone, they have too much time on their hands, and they're probably not someone I need. So I think the same goes for building your executive team early on. But let's put it to test. If you're going to start a young company, what kinds of questions should you be asking yourself about your management team? Are the founders very thick-skinned? Are they willing to say no, are willing to take no an awful lot? Do any of your founders have experience in the domain that you're operating in? Critical. No one in my company knew, when we were a restart, knew anything about the email business, and it would turn out to be a near fatal decision or lack of awareness. One of the things I counsel early idea level companies on is please decide ahead of time who's going to be the CEO. You get 3 or 4, particularly for young people. Well, we're going to figure that out later, or we're going to run it as a group or whatever, and that is an absolute disaster in almost every case. So have you already figured out who's going to do what in the leadership roles? And then as a venture capitalist, I was surprised to see how many times a group of very promising early stage entrepreneurs, 2 or 3 of the key people that you thought were part of the story, just weren't ready to make the jump and become full-time. Even if they were funded, which they're not usually at this stage, they weren't willing to take the reduced salaries or the career risk of joining a company. And so when you're getting that initial group together, you probably want to have the steely-eyed look to them and say, listen, are you really going to do this if this is successful? If not, I want to know that ahead of time and know how to count on you. So let me move on. So we get to the prototype stage, the fun part, where you actually get this idea, you feel pretty good about it, enough people that you trust have said it's going to work, so now we've got to go build something to show the world that it's real. A couple things to keep in mind. Leadership is critical here. Leadership, if it does nothing else, it's going to drive urgency, because building that prototype could take years. If you miss the mark, you will be doing this forever and ever and ever, and you will burn through whatever resources and patience you might be able to get your hands on, and urgency is absolutely essential. Unlike the idea stage, you have to be a little more careful about what you throw out, because every project that you get some success with or progress on, it turns out if it's a dead end, it's very expensive to start it over again. So obviously you got to be prepared to throw out your prototype and do another one, but be careful not to do that too many times. And this is also, I think, one of the toughest stages, because the team's commitment will be tested. The more real this prototype becomes, the more obvious it is to your stakeholders and to your potential audience that it's got issues. There's this whole market out there solving this big problem, and as you build the prototype, you realize you can only solve a small part of it. And I've been through many companies, both my own and particularly with other entrepreneurs, where they've had this huge market vision, and it's super compelling about how they can change all these things, but as they start to build the prototype, reality sets in, and they can only do a narrow part of it, and all of a sudden, that market opportunity might actually be much, much smaller than it felt originally. Leadership is critical here. So how do you know you've got the right management team? One of the things I look for, does the leadership actually understand the technical decisions being made? One of the most common failure points is that the leadership is somebody from the industry who's driving the creation of this prototype, but they have no idea about the trade-offs that are being made, and they're actually letting the development of the thing which they will sell be in the hands, and they don't know it, in the hands of some young and relatively green engineers who don't really understand the business at all. If they can't have that dialogue with the prototype creators, they're putting their business at risk. Now, obviously, a lot of them work out fine, particularly if you have a good middle manager in there, but very risky if they don't understand it. At the very least, they understand it enough to explain how it works to a non-technical audience. Particularly, can they motivate that incredible work ethic that has to take place for that urgent 24/7, we've got to get this prototype to market. And this is a unique kind of leadership. There's really not a lot of management in this, because there's no management of this. This is all creation and destruction and gut and passion at this stage. And so do they have the personal skills to take those technical people through that grueling month after month after month, Saturdays and Sundays, working until 3 in the morning to get that prototype done? It is a very unique skill. And one that if they have it, will create a very effective prototype that will sell and raise money in short order. And to that point, this is the stage where you start to think about needing outside money. Now, obviously, you can take it at the idea stage, you can take it at the beginning of the prototype stage, you can do it at all different stages, but is there someone that can be credible to investors? And you'd be surprised, you wouldn't be surprised at all actually, how many companies show up in the front doorsteps of VCs with no one that understands what a balance sheet is at all. And so obviously there are challenges getting funded in that environment. So let's go on to the third stage, the first customer stage. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where you're finally going to see if this idea that you've worked so hard on has viability. Will people actually buy this? If you've been through this stage, how many of you have gone through this stage? Have you done this before, right? When you close the first, I mean, is this the most exhilarating thing? This is like when you have a child, right? This thing actually exists. It's real. Someone's going to buy it. You've just all the people for the last 6 months or 2 years that have told you you had no idea what you're doing, you're wasting your career, and you ship this product, people start buying it and the check gets written. For me personally, that is one of the greatest experiences in my professional life. But there are obviously fraught with peril and a lot of things to keep in mind. If you are able to raise any money or continue to work for free, if you can close this customer without having them pay you, none of the stakeholders outside of that care. I've seen so many companies say, well, they're just not willing to pay enough for our, well, they're a first customer. Give it to them. Heck, pay them to take it. Because when you put that slide up there with their logo to the venture capitalists or the other 27 companies that'll buy it, they're not going to say, well, do they get a discount? Well, no. They're using it. That's all I care about. I'm scratching my head at how many companies get confused about that. But realize when you close that first customer, and the first, second, and third, and fourth customer, these are not normal customers. These are not normal people. They're wacky people, because only wacky people buy from totally untested customer. And so be careful not to build your model, your support and sales model around these first couple of customers, because they're not representative of what it takes to scale. I remember UPS, I'm sorry, a large package delivery service up, was one of SilverPop's first customers, and it was a marquee customer. Of course, we couldn't tell anybody that UPS was our customer. They were a fantastic, but there were several individuals there that were willing to tell anybody, despite the rule. They're no longer there, so I can tell the story. But they would call up anybody and say, "Oh yeah, we're at UPS, and don't quote us publicly on this, but we use SilverPop. We love SilverPop." And we thought, this is great. We had these young people inside of this giant company. They sponsored the purchase, and it turns out this didn't happen a lot after that. But getting those first guys who took a career risk at UPS to recommend and go with us turned out to be great for them and for us. At this stage, the art of management starts to matter. Thinking about projects and plans and deadlines actually has validity, but I still say that leadership is the most important part here. And particularly, you can get pretty far through the first customers with the heroics and the firefighting. And this is a point that I want to make sure I emphasize, because my company went through this stage about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, which is that when you're in that first customer, the first 10 customers, in our case, the first 50 or 100 customers, we have about 700, 800 customers now, there's that, the first couple of customers you will do anything for, and if something doesn't go the way that customer wants, they're on the phone with me personally, right? So you have an ability to execute and respond. That is why these small boutique companies are so great. And then the entire company is behind it. Well, the CEO's making calls, he's involved. So the whole company has this firefighting, heroic mentality. Well, if it hadn't been for Sally staying up till 5 in the morning and shipping this release and getting it out, we would have lost the account. But as it is, we now got $1 million target we're going to hit, yada, yada, yada. Well, that still works here. But as we go to this next stage, it totally fails. And that's a failure point for a lot of businesses. But let's just go and check real quickly whether your management team is ready for the first customer. One of the things I look for as a venture capitalist was, am I talking to a CEO or a head of sales that can actually personally close the deal? Is this person, the very technical people or the shy people or whatever, typically are not going to have any of the skills to go close that first customer. One of the highest predictors of success is if one or two of the people in the leadership, particularly if it's a CEO, can go and close that deal personally. Because it means that he or she understands the business. It means that he or she understands how to get in front of customers and connect the value proposition. And oh, by the way, if all else fails, the CEO can sell. It's a term I've used, a phrase I've used way too many times in my career, but it's true. Another subtle, often missed point, are the founders and the executives at this stage willing to compromise the vision to be successful? Because they've spent the last year or 2 years creating a prototype, building an idea that's going after the market this way, right? After this angle. It turns out that the real customer opportunity, the first couple of customer opportunities, is over here. And I've been around the board table many times where the discussion says, well, gosh darn it, we're not going to do this. This is where the opportunity is. And it's a crucial decision as to whether or not you're going to regroup a little bit and consider this. Maybe this is a one-off. Maybe this isn't really where the market is. Maybe this is the entire market and you were wrong. And how are you going to handle that? But are you willing to consider this openly? But quite a few companies, to do my opening story about at Greylock, quite a few companies end up discovering an adjacent market that's far more interesting than what they started out as. And my company has 2 or 3 versions of that story to get us where we are today. Can your execs be generalists? You don't have a full marketing staff. You don't have a deep regional sales force, and you don't have a technical support staff in an escalation process and all that, can your executives play multiple roles? Can they get on the phone with one hat and buy some media? Can they get on the phone in the other hat and assuage an upset customer about a delayed release? Can they get in with the engineers and help them solve a problem? Whatever. Can they play multiple roles? So this is the turning point for a lot of companies. This is where a tremendous number of companies start to stall, because all the things that have made them successful to this date have worked when they did more of it. More heart, more heroics, more gut, more leadership has taken them up to this stage. So clearly, that's the right formula. One of the things I said years ago, which I hold true, is the single hardest part about growing a young company is going to somebody that was crucial to getting you where you are and saying, you're now in the way. And I have done this a couple times in my career, and they are the single most painful experiences I have. Because these are people, these aren't just employees, these are people that you fought battles with, you climb mountains with. And it happens all the time. And again, one of the biggest mistakes that people make in their business growth is they don't have those conversations. Well, Sam was crucial to getting us here. We can't do it. I mean, Sam's the only one that knows how to do it. So there's no way. I mean, but the new people you want to hire, the new people you've hired say, Sam just says no to everything. He won't let us go forward with this. The customers are screaming for this, and Sam says, no, we got to go this way. Pretty daunting. So you're at the many customer stage. This is the stage where an idea gets translated into shareholder value. You've shown that people will buy it, but now you're going to create the first level of scale. This is where management must matter. It's no longer optional. This is where process and goals and measurements start to become necessary to actually deliver on the promises that you made, period. There is no way around it at this stage. It's surprising, and I've said this several times, how many companies die here. And by die, I don't necessarily mean they go bankrupt, but they turn into something that's not interesting. You know, they go horizontal, as we used to say in the VC space, and they get sold for, if you're lucky, the money you put in. And nobody considers it a success. It looks great in the resume for the founders and things like that, because they at least got a company to that stage, which is a massive accomplishment. But for want of a little more realization about how companies actually grow, these great ideas that are proven could become big, big companies, and they don't because of egos and politics and history. One of the biggest mistakes, I made this so many times in my career, is how do you build a middle management team? And what you do, obviously, is you got this salesperson who's been crucial in your first 3 accounts, and you got this engineer that was the architect of the product you're selling, and they're saying, Bill, I'm ready for the next step. I don't want to be selling anymore. I want to manage sales. And the engineer says, I don't want to be coding anymore. I've done that for 10 years. What I really want to do is manage the coders. And I've been loosely managing the 2 guys working for me. I've been the VP of engineering, the 2 guys work for me. But I'm ready to hire 10 and be the real boss. And that is a disaster most of the time. Typically the very best individual contributors, the very kind of people that can create these prototypes, that can close these first customers, are terrible at actually managing. It turns out they hate it. This is the Peter principle, promoting people to their level of incompetence. And it's a derogatory view, because these are the most important people in growing your company. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, is it better to have these people leave, as devastating as that'll be to the culture and the progress we've made so far, than it is to have them be managers, which can stop you the next stage down, just stop you dead. You know, because these people typically won't hire as strong of people to work for them. They're threatened by them, et cetera, et cetera. So we can talk more about that at another time, but that is a common mistake, and I don't know how to avoid it, because clearly these people said, I've slaved for you for 2 years. I have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that I'm committed and capable, and you're going to bring in some numbnuts from the outside that doesn't have anything about this company in his veins. I've had that conversation, and sometimes I've promoted him, and sometimes I haven't. I don't know what the right answer is, but I can tell you it's not easy. So how do you know if you're doing the right thing? How do you know if you have the right management team in place? One of the first signs that I look for here is, do you have executives who are willing to execute decisions they didn't make? Are you willing to say to them, you're going to do this thing even though you don't believe in it? It's not a decision that you either were participating in or, more importantly, that you argued against. In a young company, you don't have this problem, because either people aren't going to commit to that business if they don't believe in the direction you're taking. But when you get larger now, you've got to be willing to say to people, I appreciate your opinion, we've heard everyone's opinion, but we're going to do this instead. And a large number of young company executives will just stop and say, no. This is largely why I got my job at Silverpop, because the management team at the time had gotten to that intractable position. They were not willing to go forward as a company because different factions had decided they wanted to go in different directions, and it simply stopped. Actually, it hadn't stopped. They were going in separate directions, and it was in a failure in the making. Train wreck, a slow train wreck. To the story I said about promoting people in functional roles to executive roles over those functions, I think even more profound is the move from generalist to specialist. And this is very subtle. In order to survive at the second and third phase, you need to have people that can play multiple roles, that are happy being marketers one day and salespeople the next day, being engineers one day and tech support the next. Those people are a unique kind of person, and I revere them personally. I personally think of myself as a generalist. And I love being able to focus on different areas and exercise different muscles in my skill set depending on the challenge of the day. But as you grow, most people lose the ability or the opportunity to be generalists. And they fight it because that's where their sense of satisfaction derives. And what happens in a lot of young companies at this stage is people that were really happy playing those multiple roles are becoming increasingly unhappy. And they're trying to step outside the role that they clearly are moving into, and they're trying to influence other departments and areas that no one wants to hear from. And this is a real failure mode for a lot of different businesses. Will you be able to move beyond firefighting into process? And one of the things I say at Silverpop all the time is we have a company recognition every month of employees. And I make sure I balance between the people that worked until 4 a.m. to make this critical thing and get done, and recognizing those people, between the people that just delivered every single project on time. And none of the projects are terribly hard, but every single time they get it done without a lot of hoopla. And I started to recognize those people as well, because as we grow, and we're in the final stage at my company with 270 people, we need to focus on the process. So we're the last stage, in the grown-up stage. This is where the VCs are actually going to make most of their money. This is where the founders are going to be able to retire rich. It's an exciting stage. Most companies don't get here, and they can still be branded tremendously successful. But it is an exciting stage, and it's worth mentioning, and it's particularly relevant for me because these are issues that I'm looking at today myself. You shift from creating opportunities to creating predictability and stability. I mean, if you're a founder and you're all about being radical and inventive, this is death. This is the worst possible thing you could want to do. And that's a real issue I'll talk about in a second. This is where the culture shifts dramatically. This is where you cross 100, 120 people. In my experience, and I actually was going to do my original presentation on this alone, but that shift past 120, 130 people results in a 180-degree shift in the culture in a business. It is such a big deal. I've spoken about it many times. There's been studies on it. But this is where leadership typically fails, and this is where people, and you've heard this before if you've been in young companies, this place has lost its soul. Everyone used to care, and everyone used to know everybody. There was a sense of commitment and ownership. Now nobody cares. That's not my job, is what they say. It's the, I'm going home at 5 because I've got a baseball game. And what happened? No one cares anymore. And I will tell you that sometimes that's bad, but sometimes that's fine. And one day, if I ever write another book, it'll be on this, because I think this is probably the biggest area of opportunity that turns into failure for businesses. But the great news about this, if you recognize it, is there's an entirely new kind of employee that's available to you. People that don't want to be in startups, that want the very steady paycheck, that want to know what their job is in a written job description, and to want to have reviews every 6 months so they know exactly where they stand. Now, some of these people are rock stars. And they weren't even going to talk to you when you were a startup. And I've been surprised at how many people like this we've hired out of, I typically don't like hiring from large companies, but when you're hiring individual contributors out of large companies, this is a great stage for these people. Because this is their training wheels to get to be in a startup world, which they want to do, but they don't have to do all the crazy stuff in the first 4 stages. So we've been really lucky with the kind of folks we've been able to get at this stage. So how do you know you're ready for this? Do some of your executives like to read spreadsheets? If the answer is no to this, you're probably in trouble. So I've been recruiting for years and have at least 2 people on my team that really think spreadsheets are cool. Show me the product, dagnabbit, that's all I want to see. But they like looking at spreadsheets, and you need that, and that's a good measure. Do you have people that actually done this before? You need at least one person that can say, you know what, this culture is going to change. You know what, we need to hire people differently. You know what, we have risk in this area. You don't need a lot, but you need someone who's in a position of influence to help drive the rest of the management team. And this is tough. I was counseling one of my colleagues yesterday, and I said, you know, the person said, I'm spending most of my day, this is someone that reports to me, we're spending most of my day just dealing with people issues and not really actually getting in. And I know you need me to manage the operations of things. I said, no, actually what I need you to do is to develop your people. And if the size we're at, if you're spending almost all your time developing people, you're probably okay. And I counsel first-time CEOs and I counsel executives who work for me at this level. I said, your job has moved into what I call the den mother role. You're going to spend most of your time dealing with the histrionics of a bunch of crazy people, trying to get them to do the obvious stuff that you would do yourself in a heartbeat. And you laugh, but I have to a CEO, I've probably given that advice to new CEOs 20 times, and to a person they've come back and said, "My gosh, that was good advice," because that is what it is. And so it's a people job at that stage. So let me wrap up with a couple of key points so we have some time for questions. There is no other role in a company that defines the growth more than a founder. I've been a founder, and I have wrestled with founders, and as an investor, I have fired founders. And an investor, I have heralded founders that have taken the company all the way to IPOs. I mean, I've seen it all. But founders are the most interesting and unique part of these young companies. There are reasons that founders are absolutely awesome, right? Because they will look at a status quo and they will say, damn the status quo, we are going to invent something new that no one understands, we're going to change the world. And they will be able to get mounds of people behind them who believe in this just through the sheer power of their charisma. That is why founders are amazing. Let me tell you why founders are terrible. Because they defy conventional wisdom, and because they get lots of really good people following them to do exactly what they want. Good, it worked. And so the point is, in the first couple of stages, that this pivotal skill set is defining, and without it you will fail. And the same exact skill set when you're later in the business will kill you. I consider myself somewhat of an expert on founders, and I can make fun of them because I've been one, and I've been this person. I went to my investors at Da Vinci, my first company, and said about 4 or 5 years in, and I said, you know what? 6, 7 years in, I said, I understand. I was very young. I was in my mid-20s, late 20s, and I said, I'm willing to step aside. I'm willing as a CEO to bring in some executive management, and I know that I don't know everything. And it was a tough conversation, and they looked at me and said, Bill, we think you're just fine. You stick it out. You go for it. You're a great CEO. You know, we're behind you 100%. And I remember it was because I went home and thought about it for a couple of years. I thought, wow, this is really great. You know what? They love me. I'm really accomplished. And then it occurred to me about 2 or 3 years later, and I talked to them about this, and they laughed and they said, there was no chance of finding anyone else to run that ragtag company of yours. So we just didn't want you to feel bad about it. Thank goodness we sold it and made some money on it. But wow. And so, you know, founders require this emotional management. It's unusual. So anyway, founders are a unique breed. So I'm going to fly through a couple of things that I think have really been some of the best management techniques I've seen applying to these growth companies. Keep the management team at the young stages of the company in the same geography at all costs. The greatest invention occurs next to the water cooler at the foosball table. You cannot do it on conference calls. You cannot do great invention on getting together once a week. It's amazing to me how many times I see early stage companies where they couldn't find the CEO locally, so they bring her in from another state. She flies in Mondays through Wednesdays. And sometimes that's the best you can do, but my goodness, I would take 2 levels below in resume to have someone locally who's got leadership skills to have someone that flies in. That's why VCs need to be local as well, by the way. It's particularly for early stage companies. Now, all my VCs are from Silicon Valley, but generally speaking, for inexperienced companies, having local VCs is great if you go that route. People, when they're trying to build a management team, and I talked about this here in this room last year, the things you look for, I would say don't look for secondary to the right functions and skills and resumes, secondary to styles and how do we solve problems. The most important thing to look for is common values. And I have experienced directly and painfully working with a management team with different values. And you don't notice it when everything's up and coming and great, but when things don't go well, those values will kill a company. And values are how you handle customers, how you deal with crises. What do you do about an employee that's worked hard in the past but doesn't meet the needs going forward? How do you handle those situations? That's what values are. I will take energy, brains, and a chip on their shoulder to prove something any day over a resume. Now, hopefully you don't have to make that compromise, but I have spent too many hours in my life pursuing the ultimate resume for someone on my team, and I've said that the number of times that's worked out well for me over the young up-and-comer who's trying to prove him or herself has not been big. Sometimes, obviously you want someone with both, the big resume and that energy, but it's harder to find, obviously. One of the things that I've discovered that works great, when you're in this intense stage of a business, you absolutely, people will get on each other's case. They will get that friction and tension. And one of the best things is to take them out of work, whatever the culture of your company is. There's a big company in Atlanta that's gone public and is famous, and I'm not going to mention them by name, but they had these absolute wild parties. I mean, absolutely wild parties. And that was part of their culture, and it reflected the CEO's personality. It was fine. You know, at my company, we're not a wild personality. We do, dumb things like go drive go-karts. But we get people outside of work, and we remind them why they like each other. Because there's so many reasons during the day to remind themselves why they don't like each other. And you need to remind, because they're all good people. One thing, and I was also going to do my presentation on this also by itself, but I'll just wrap up at this point, which is that there's a huge body of academic work on the longer a team works together, the better it performs, and that is a more important quality than resumes and even hours and work ethic and things like that. The longer a team works together, the better it performs. And when I came to Silverpop 7 years ago, the number one thing I looked for in the executive team was this a group that I can work for the next 5 years. And we've actually had, in our top 10 people, we've had 2 people leave in the last 7 years. Everyone else has been together for the entire time, and the management team is rocking. So we've only got a few minutes left, and I'm not going to go through this, but the great news is that if you have the privilege of working in a small, young company, you will do something, even if you only do it once in your life, you'll do something that will probably stick with you and help you define who you are for the rest of your life. It is, to me, one of the greatest experiences professionally you can ever have. And if you step back, think about how you're going to grow that business, and step away from the ego, step away from sort of what worked well in the past, and look objectively at each stage, you have it's amazing how often that companies don't die because they don't have a product, don't have enough customers. They die because they aren't willing to make the changes necessary to get to the next step. If you can get through that, if you can have advisors, and if you're the kind of personality that can look inward, you will have the opportunity to create a tremendous success and potentially create a career of doing this kind of company. So thank you very much, and I think we have about 3 or 4 minutes if anyone has any questions. Thank you. Thanks. The question is, how do you build a culture from initially that allows the founders to be comfortable that their role isn't long-term and that they'll leave easily, and help them recognize that when they do leave, the timing is such that they'll benefit tremendously? The answer to that is just as simple as another question we ask ourselves is, how do I raise children to make sure that they're successful as adults? I'm right smack dab in the middle of that one, and it's looking kind of bleak right now. But there is no good answer to how to do that. I've given this speech. Charlie and I were talking early on and to this morning, and you give the speech to the founders and you say, listen, this is going to be your outcome, and you can get, do you understand me? I absolutely understand you, Bill. You really, truly, in your heart understand. You may not always, oh, I completely understand. So 3 years later, all right, it's time, we need to have that conversation. What? Don't you remember the emails, and I actually wrote it down in a letter so you could go back, no, that was never meant, you never meant that. So it is a very painful experience that is unavoidable for most founders, unless they've actually done it a couple of times and realize it works out. And I'd also argue that the time that is usually good for them to not necessarily leave the company, but to play a reduced role is well before the value creation is clear. So it isn't obvious to them that they're creating it. I've used, as a VC, I've used the expression many times, don't these people understand that this decision is the best thing they can do to make themselves rich? And the answer is never. They don't ever understand it. The question is, as founders struggle to go through that transition, is it lack of trust in their people to give them input, including sales, or is it more of a pride thing that they just don't want to give up the reins? Exactly. And I would say that having been a founder and worked with some founders successfully and unsuccessfully, it's actually more fundamental than that. Imagine if you're the kind of person, and most founders are this kind of person, where you go through your life and you're always sort of 90 degrees or 85 degrees different than everybody else. And you're popular, but you just don't accomplish things the same way. And then you get into this startup thing. And everyone's telling you you're crazy and this is just more of your shenanigans. And you go and you push it, and despite all that input, you end up creating something that matters and is recognized. When I started, my father told me, Bill, don't go start a business. You don't have the personality. You don't have the tenacity. You'll be unsuccessful. I love you. Don't waste your time on it. When we created a viable business, can you imagine how vindicated I felt? I mean, it was like, wow, you know, man, you were so wrong. So if your whole life you were a bit off the beaten path, and you finally find vindication that all those things you've always done are right, it's very difficult in the fourth and fifth stage of a company to understand it's not right anymore. You spent your whole life trying to prove that the crazy things you do work, and now they work for the first time, and it's a life experience for many people. They're not willing to go back and say, I'm not willing to accept it's contextual, that I've been vindicated finally, so shut up and listen to me. And it does manifest itself as trust and ego and everything else. It's a big break.
Two more questions.
Do I have a list of things that you need to have accomplished to go to a VC? I'm an advisor. I advise a lot of businesses, and one business came to me recently, and I offered kind of an informal basis. I do about one of these a year, and I tend to be busy with other parts of my life. But I'm helping one company right now, and it was introduced by some mutual folks that we know well. And so the entrepreneur came to my office and said, I want to help me refine my pitch for the VCs. And I'll tell you, my advice to him was, you're way ahead of yourself. Don't take this to any VCs yet. And so some of the things that I think you need to look for, you need to have a bottoms-up calculation of how you're going to hit the hockey stick, not just an aspirational one. And by the way, if your hockey stick for VCs and your revenue sounds like all I need to do is get 2% of the market, VCs actually laugh amongst themselves when entrepreneurs come in with that. Oh yeah, just 2% of the market. Wouldn't that be? I'd like 2% of the U.S. food market. I'd like 2% of the airline market. That's all I got to do is 2%. I'll be rich. It tends to be difficult. The guys that own 100% of it don't want to give it to you. You got to have a bottoms up. If I can close these customers for this cost, and here's the cycle, here's my retention rate. That's one milestone a lot of people don't get. I think realistically, you want to have a growth plan for your management team. Okay, Mr. VC, Mrs. VC, this guy over here is great, but we know ahead of time that he's not really going to be the VP of this. And the best thing that young entrepreneurs, early entrepreneurs say is, I don't think I'm going to be the CEO in 2 years. That's a pivotal conversation. They never really mean it, but it's important to be able to go to VCs. But the best thing is the very best thing, and the thing that trumps all others is, do you have something that's prototype or something that's approaching a prototype that there's a customer over here saying, yes, maybe with the best is yes, I bought it, or yes with a caveat. If it gets this, this, and this, I'm from Procter & Gamble, I'm from UPS, I'm from wherever, and I'm going to buy it when it gets to this stage. Then everything else is secondary if you have that, in my opinion. Did you use VC and Atlanta market in the same sentence? That much? Some of my dearest friends work at Nora Mosley and some of the other very few VC firms in Atlanta. We have a good angel network, and I wouldn't call it. We have relative to the opportunities in universities and the startup people in Atlanta, we have a small VC community, and it's struggled, and it's a regular conversation. I was at the Chamber of Commerce 2 weeks ago, and we had a lot of the people that have larger businesses in Atlanta, young companies, but larger ones, were talking about this issue. And most of the companies that were there were funded by out of state. And so that being said, I think there's a real recognition in Atlanta. We do have some excellent local VCs, but there's fewer of them than there should be. And I think the problem is that they're very busy, and they have from their point of view, it's great. They actually said that everyone has to go to Nora Mosley as an example. There's several others. But everyone has to go to Nora Mosley, so they're going to see every deal in town, and they can pick from a better set. So they're not looking for Silicon Valley to come in. I think that if you had an early stage company that you felt good about and your advisors told you it had legs, you'd probably be well served to get on a plane and go to Boston and Silicon Valley if you could, and then use that as a way to get some of the higher in the attention level of the local guys who have a lot of value. But if there's, like for example, if you're starting a Web 2.0 company, up until recently, the local guys didn't have some of that skill. They hadn't done a lot of deals like that. Now they have some. But you go to Silicon Valley, that's all they do. And so those, if you have a company that's likely to exit to Google, the local guys only have limited connections there. On the other hand, if you're doing a B2B security software business, the local community is awesome. The people that can help you both as VCs and board members is huge. Business-to-business software, finance software, that stuff's, you got a huge community here. So it also depends on the kind of business you're in.
Thank you for your questions, and let's give us another round of applause.
Thanks, guys.